Hello, guys. Welcome back to Faith Movies. Today's movie recap will be a mystery and thriller movie from 2018 called Interview with God. Warning, there are spoilers ahead. The film begins with Christian hymns singing God Moves in a Mysterious Way. The main character, Paul Asher, is a young journalist who has just returned home after covering the war in Afghanistan. On his way back, he thinks a lot about his faith and gets lost in his thoughts. He calls a veteran named Matt, whom he met during the war. Matt is struggling after being discharged, and Paul is trying to help him. But Paul is so busy that he neglects his wife, Sarah, who needs his attention urgently. Paul has made mistakes that hurt their marriage, and Sarah is upset. Even though Paul promises he has changed, Sarah doesn't believe him. Paul goes to interview an old man about religion. Usually he writes lifestyle articles, but this time he's writing about religion. During the interview, the old man tries to learn more about Paul, but Paul is in a hurry to start the interview. When Paul asks for the old man's name, the old man says he is God. Paul laughs and says the old man looks human, but the old man responds that Paul looks godlike to him. Confused, Paul asks why he agreed to the interview, and the old man says he likes to talk to his children sometimes. Paul asks if he speaks to prophets, and the old man says many prophets weren't happy to see him. Paul doesn't take him seriously and asks the old man to set a tree on fire. The old man asks Paul if he really wants to set the tree on fire since it could harm people in the park. Paul then begins the interview, confirming that the man is indeed God who created heaven and earth in 6 days. The man suggests asking different questions since basic facts can be found in any book. Paul insists on confirming the facts for his readers. Paul asks God's age, and the man replies that he exists outside of time because he created time. When Paul asks why he was chosen as the interviewer, the old man says it's because Paul has degrees in religious studies and journalism, making him the best fit. When the old man mentions Paul's marriage, Paul is momentarily surprised, but then realizes his wedding ring gave it away. Paul asks if heaven exists, and God confirms it, but says it's more than a place. Paul then inquires about Satan, learning that Satan exists but is overrated and only has the power people give him. When Paul asks what happens to humans after they die, the man says they are reunited with the everlasting. Amidst all the questions, the old man points out that Paul hasn't asked one of the most famous questions: why do bad things happen to good people? Paul admits he didn't include it because it feels more like a complaint than a question. Impressed, the old man encourages Paul to continue the interview. Paul asks if free will exists, and God is pleased that Paul is finally asking meaningful questions. Paul clarifies that the questions are not for himself, but the old man doesn't believe him. God then says his will led Paul to Afghanistan, knowing it would impact Paul's personality and family. Paul responds that he prayed for God's protection while he was away. The man suggests that he has come to help Paul and prefers to call their interview a conversation. Paul mentions he is being paid for the interview, and since their time is up, will meet him again the next day. The man replies that the next meeting will be determined, which puzzles Paul. Curious, Paul asks what is going on, and the man says they will continue their conversation next time. Paul walks away, and after a few steps, turns around to find the man has disappeared. Confused, Paul heads towards his bike and suddenly sees white feathers flying in the air. He doesn't think much of it and goes to his office. In his cabin, he receives a call from a girl who insists on meeting him. Paul tries to dismiss her, and just then, he is startled to see his editor, Gary, standing behind him. Gary scolds him for not taking any time off despite having paid leave. He assures Paul that there's nothing wrong with relaxing, especially after covering a war. Paul tells Gary that he is fine and will consider taking a break. He also asks Gary to help his friend Matt, who is suffering from PTSD. After this conversation, Gary asks Paul what he is working on. Paul quietly mentions that he is interviewing God. Gary thinks it's a great idea and suggests putting the article on the front page. Paul was surprised by the positive feedback since he had been doubting the project. After Gary leaves, Paul calls Sarah and leaves a message saying he wants to fix their failing marriage. Sarah listens to the message but doesn't reply. After work, Paul returns home but doesn't find Sarah there. He starts working on his article but feels overwhelmed by a personal crisis he can't understand. Frustrated, he smashes a cup and cuts his hand. The next morning, he leaves the apartment and goes to an empty theater where his mother used to work. He finds the man who claimed to be God on the stage and walks toward him to continue the interview. Seeing Paul's injury, the man tells him he can skip the day if he wants. Paul apologizes for the previous day, admitting he let the interview become too much about himself and promises it won't happen again. God starts talking about salvation and asks Paul for his thoughts on it. Paul hesitates but then explains that he believes salvation means returning to a state of perfection with God, being free from sin forever, and reuniting with God for eternity after a lifetime on earth. God is impressed by Paul's answer and asks how a person can achieve salvation. Paul warns that this is the last question he will answer before continuing with the interview. He answers that salvation can be achieved by following the Bible's instructions, but he finds them confusing. God responds that no one ever said his will would be easy. Paul pauses and asks what this is all about. God tells Paul that his idea of faith is not correct. Paul tells him to change the subject, not wanting to talk about it. When God insists, Paul loses his temper and decides to walk away. The man then tells him to talk about his marriage, causing Paul to explode in anger for bringing up his personal life. God cryptically tells him that he is out of time. At first, Paul doesn't understand, but then realizes he is about to die, and he storms out. Before he leaves, God tells him that salvation is real and can be achieved, but it takes time and dedication to develop faith. God asks if Paul wants to know when he will die, but Paul leaves, saying no. Dazed, Paul rides his bike to his office, frequently checking his reflection for changes. He finds Grace, Sarah's sister, waiting in his office. He pulls her into Gary's room to talk privately. Grace turns out to be the woman Paul cheated on Sarah with. She reveals that Sarah had an affair before Paul went to Afghanistan. Paul is shocked. Just then, Gary walks in and gives Paul the psychiatrist's name for Matt. Grace tells Paul that Sarah is living with her and advises him to give Sarah some time. After Grace leaves, Paul calls Matt. He asks Matt to run a background check on the man he's interviewing. Gary appears and asks what's wrong. Paul reveals that Sarah left him and that the interview is consuming him. Gary advises Paul to take time off to sort things out. Feeling overwhelmed, Paul decides to end his life by jumping off the roof. He calls Sarah, but she doesn't answer. She feels guilty for ruining their marriage and Paul's faith. Paul reconsiders suicide and returns to his apartment. He wonders why God is revealing himself instead of staying hidden. He works on the interview and falls asleep. The next morning, he goes to the final session of the interview. He meets God in a secluded room and says he wants to reach conclusions today. Paul insists on discussing salvation further. God explains that salvation is a broad topic and offers more depth. He tells Paul that he has given him the greatest gift of responsibility and justification, urging him to accept it before it's too late. Paul questions whether it's a gift or a threat. God says it took thousands of years to find Paul, and he wants him to follow the path of righteousness. He emphasizes that Paul is in the midst of a personal crisis. Frustrated, Paul decides to leave. God tells him that he has been helping Paul by giving him something to think about other than his problems. Paul ignores him and walks out. He then gets a message from Matt saying that the man he's interviewing died 12 years ago in Afghanistan. Shocked, Paul returns to the room and angrily asks who the man really is. God says Paul already knows, as he is the one who called him for the interview. Paul, distraught, asks why God isn't helping him. God gives him hope, saying he can fix many things, like helping his friend and saving his marriage. A white light appears, and God disappears into it. Paul wakes up in the same room and receives a text from Matt asking him to call. Paul leaves the building and realizes his bike was stolen because he forgot to lock it. He walks home and calls Matt, who says he feels better. When Paul arrives at his apartment, he finds Sarah on the stairs. She apologizes and expresses her love. Paul invites her inside to talk, and they enter the apartment together. The film ends with Paul explaining that faith is not valuable if one doesn't truly believe in it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to give a thumbs up and subscribe. Your support is appreciated. Remember, Jesus loves you. Have a blessed day, and see you next time.